13. None but those who knew Karenina most intimately knew that this apparently cold and sober-minded man had one weakness, quite inconsistent with the general trend of his character. Karenina could not with equanimity hear or see a child or a woman weeping. The sight of tears upset him and made him quite incapable of reasoning. The chief of his staff and his secretary knew this, and warned women who came with petitions that they should on no account give way to tears if they did not want to spoil their case. "You will get angry, I won't listen to you," they said. And in such cases, the mental perturbation which tears produced in Karenina really found expression in hurried bursts of anger. "I can do nothing for you. Kindly go away," he would shout on these occasions. When Anna, on their way home from the races, announced to him what her relations with Vronsky were, and immediately hid her face in her hands and began crying, Karenina, despite his indignation with her, was as usual overcome by that mental perturbation. Being aware of this, and of the fact that any expression he could at that moment find for his feelings would be incompatible with the situation, he tried to conceal all signs of life within himself, and neither moved nor looked at her. That was the cause of the strange, death-like look on his face which had so struck Anna. When they reached home, he helped her out of the carriage and took leave of her with his usual courtesy, uttering non-committal words. He said he would let her know his decision next day. His wife's words, confirming as they did his worst suspicions, had given Karenina cruel pain in his heart. This pain was rendered more acute by physical pity for her, evoked by her tears. But when alone in the carriage, to his surprise and joy, he felt completely relieved of that pity, and of the suspicions and jealousy that had lately so tormented him. He felt like a man who had just had a tooth drawn, which has been hurting him a long time. After terrible pain and a sensation as if something enormous, bigger than his whole head, were being pulled out of his jaw, he feels, scarcely believing in his happiness, that the thing which has so long been poisoning his life and engrossing his attention no longer exists, and that it is possible again to live, think, and be interested in other things. What Karenina experienced was a feeling of this kind. It had been a strange and terrible pain, but it was past, and he felt he could again live and think of other things beside his wife. Without honour, without heart, without religion, a depraved woman. I knew it and could see it all along, though I tried out of pity for her to deceive myself, thought he. And it really seemed to him that he had always seen it. He recalled all the details of their past life, and details which he had not previously considered wrong, now proved to him clearly that she had always been depraved. I made a mistake when I bound up my life with hers, but in my mistake there was nothing blameworthy. Therefore, I ought not to be unhappy. It is not I who am guilty, he said to himself, but it is she. She does not concern me. She does not exist for me. What would happen to her and to her son, toward whom his feelings had changed as they had toward her, no longer occupied his mind. The one thing that preoccupied him was the question of how he could best divest himself of the mud with which she and her fall had bespattered him. Of how to do it in the way which would be most decent, most convenient for him, and consequently fairest, and how he should continue his active, honest, and useful career. I ought not to be unhappy because a despicable woman has committed a crime, but I must find the best way out of this painful situation in which she has placed me. And find it I will, he said to himself, frowning more and more. I am not the first, and shall not be the last. And without taking into account the historical instances of wives' unfaithfulness, beginning with Menelaus and La Belle Hélène, whose memory had just recently been fresh in everybody's mind, quite a number of cases of infidelity, the infidelity of modern wives, occurred to Karenina. Daryalov, Poltavsky, Prince Karibanov, Count Paskudin, Dram, yes, even Dram, that honest, business-like fella, Semenov, Chagin, Sigonin, he passed them in review. It's true a kind of unreasonable ridicule falls on these men, but I never could see it in any other light than a misfortune. I felt nothing but sympathy, Karenina reflected, though it was not true. He had never felt any sympathy of the kind, and the more cases he had come across of husbands being betrayed by their wives, the better the opinion he had had of himself. It is a misfortune that may befall anyone, and has befallen me. The only question is, how best to face the situation. And he began mentally reviewing the courses pursued by other men in similar positions. Daryalov fought a duel. In his youth, Karenina had been particularly attracted by the idea of dueling, just because he was physically a timid man and was quite aware of it. He could not think without horror of a pistol being levelled at him, and had never used any kind of weapon. This horror had in his youth often induced him to take mental measure of his strength, in case he should ever be confronted by a situation in which it would be necessary to face danger. Since, however, he had achieved success and gained a firm position in the world, he had long forgotten that feeling. But the old habit now revived and claimed its own, and the fear of being a coward was again so strong that he considered this point a long time, and flattered his vanity with the idea of a duel, though he knew beforehand that he would on no account fight one. Of course, our society is still so uncivilized, not as in England, that very many, among the many were those whose opinion Karenina particularly valued, would regard a duel as the right thing. But what object would be gained? Supposing I challenged him, continued Karenina, and vividly picturing to himself the night he would spend after the challenge, and the sensation of having a pistol pointed at him, he shuddered and realized that he would never do it. Supposing, he went on, they showed me how to do it, placed me, and I pulled the trigger. He closed his eyes, and it turned out that I had killed him. And he shook his head to drive away the stupid thought. What sense is there in killing a man in order to define one's relations with a guilty wife and a son? Nevertheless, I shall have to decide what to do with her. But what is even more likely, and sure to happen, is that I should be killed or wounded. Then I, an innocent man, should be the victim. That would be still more senseless. And this is not all. A challenge from me would not be an honest action. Do I not know beforehand that my friends would never allow me to go so far as to fight a duel? Would not allow a statesman whom Russia needs to expose himself to danger? What then would happen? This would happen. I, knowing beforehand that matters would never be allowed to reach a dangerous point, should have challenged a man in order to cover myself with false glamour. That would be dishonest. It would be false. It would be deceiving myself as well as others. No, a duel is unthinkable, and no one expects it of me. My aim is to safeguard my reputation, which I need for the uninterrupted pursuit of my career. His official pursuits, which had always appeared essential to Karenina, now assumed even greater importance. Having considered and rejected the idea of a duel, Karenina turned his thoughts to divorce, the next expedient of which some of the wronged husbands he remembered had availed themselves. Going over all the cases of divorce he knew, there were very many, and in the highest society, with which he was all acquainted, Karenina could not recall one in which the purpose of the divorce was the one he had in view. In all these cases the husband had ceded or sold the unfaithful wife, and the very person who according to law had no right to remarry, entered into fictitious, pseudo-legal relations with the pretended husband. Karenina saw that in his own case it would be impossible to obtain a legal divorce. That is, a divorce in which the guilty wife would be simply cast off. He knew that in their complex conditions of life it would not be possible to obtain those coarse proofs of a wife's infidelity which the law demanded. He knew that in that life there was a certain convention of refinement which would not allow him to bring forward such proofs, had they existed, because such an action would make him sink even lower than she in public opinion. To attempt a divorce could only lead to a lawsuit and a scandal which would give his enemies great opportunity for calumny and would lower his high position in society. The chief object of his life, the settling of conditions with the least possible amount of disturbance, could not be furthered by divorce. Besides, it was evident that as a consequence of divorce, the wife would break off relations with her husband and unite with her lover. In Karenina's soul, however, despite the complete and contemptuous indifference he thought he felt for his wife, there was one feeling left with regard to her. An objection to her being in a position to unite unhindered with Vronsky, so making her crime advantageous to her. The very thought of it irritated him to such an extent that he groaned with inner pain, rose, and changed his place in the carriage. And for a long while after that, he sat wrapping his fluffy rug round his bony, easily chilled legs. Besides a formal divorce, it would be possible to act as Karibanov, Paskurin, and that good-natured Dram did, and just separate, he resumed when he had grown calm again. But this measure would avoid the inconvenience of a divorce scandal, and would throw his wife into Vronsky's arms just in the same way. No, it is impossible, impossible, he said aloud, again wrapping the rug round his legs. I cannot be unhappy, but she and he must not be happy. The jealousy that had tormented him during the period of uncertainty had left him when his wife's words had with great pain drawn that aching tooth. But another feeling had now taken the place of the jealousy. It was a wish that his wife's guilt should meet with retribution. He did not acknowledge it to himself, but in the depths of his soul he wished her to suffer for impairing his peace of mind and his honour. And having reviewed the possibilities of a duel, of divorce, and of separation, and having again rejected them, Karenina came to the conclusion that there was only one course to be followed: to keep her with him, hiding from the world what had happened, and taking all necessary steps to put a stop to her love affair. And above all, though he did not confess this to himself, to punish her. I must inform her of my decision, that after considering the painful situation in which she has placed her family, I think that an external status quo would be better for both parties than any other expedient, and that I am prepared to keep to that, on the strict understanding on her part that she will obey my will and break off relations with her lover. In confirmation of this decision, after it had already been reached, another powerful argument occurred to Karenina. It is only by this course that I can conform with religion, said he to himself. It is the only way that makes it possible for me not to disown my guilty wife, and to give her a chance of repenting, and even, painful as it will be, to devote part of my powers to her redemption. Though Karenina knew that he could have no moral influence on his wife, that all his attempts to redeem her would lead to nothing but lies, and although during the painful moments he had lived through, he had not once thought of seeking guidance in religion, now that his decision was, as he imagined, in conformity with religion, its sanction afforded him great satisfaction and even some comfort. It was pleasant to think that no one would have a right to say that in such an important crisis in his life he had not acted in accordance with that religion whose banner he had always held aloft amid general coldness and indifference. Proceeding to consider further details, Karenina could not even see why his relations with his wife should not remain almost the same as before. He could of course never again revive his respect for her, but there was no occasion for him to spoil his own life and to suffer just because she had proved a bad and unfaithful wife. Yes, time goes on, and time, which cures everything, will restore the old conditions, said Karenina to himself. That is, it will restore them in so far that I shall not have this worry during the rest of my life. She must be unhappy, but I am not guilty, and therefore I cannot suffer. "14. By the time he reached Petersburg, Karenina had not only resolved to keep to his decision, but had mentally composed a letter to his wife. On entering the hall of his house, he glanced at the letters and papers which had been sent from the ministry, and ordered them to be brought into his study. "Tell him to unharness, and no one is to be admitted," he said in an answer to the hall porter's inquiry, accentuating with a certain pleasure the word "admitted." It was a sign that he was in good spirits. He paced twice up and down his study, and then halted at the gigantic writing table, on which his valet had already lit 6 candles. Cracking his fingers, he sat down and arranged his writing materials. With his elbow on the table and his head bent to one side, he sat and thought for a minute, and then wrote without an instant's pause. He did not begin by addressing her, and wrote in French, using the plural pronoun you, which in French does not sound as cold and distant as it does in Russian. "During our last conversation, I expressed my intention of communicating my decision with reference to the subject of that conversation. Having carefully and fully considered everything, I now write to fulfill my promise. My decision is as follows. Whatever your actions may have been, I do not consider myself justified in severing the bonds with which a higher power has united us. A family must not be broken up through the caprice, perversity, or even crime of one of the married couple, and our life must go on as heretofore. This is unavoidable for my sake, for yours, and for that of our son. I am perfectly convinced that you have repented, and are repenting, of the action which has led to this letter, and will completely cooperate with me to eradicate the cause of our discord and to forget the past. If not, you can yourself foresee what awaits you and your son. I hope to talk all this over with you in more detail at a personal interview. As the summer season is drawing to a close, I would ask you to return to Petersburg as soon as possible, and not later than Tuesday. All necessary preparations shall be made for your return. I beg you to note that I attach importance to this request of mine. A. Karenina. P.S. I enclose some money which you may need for your expenses. He read the letter over and was satisfied with it, especially with having remembered to enclose the money. There was not a single cruel word or threat in it, yet it was not yielding in tone. Above all, it provided a golden bridge for her to return by. Having folded the letter, smoothed it out with a massive ivory paper knife, and put it and the money in an envelope, with the pleasure that the use of his well-arranged writing appliances always caused him, he rang. Give this to the messenger, and tell him to take it to the country, to Anna Arkadyevna, tomorrow, he said, and got up. Yes, Your Excellency. Shall tea be served in the study? Karenina assented, and, toying with his paper knife, went to his armchair, beside which a lamp was burning, and a French book about the Ujibine tables was lying ready. Above the armchair hung a beautiful painted portrait of Anna by a celebrated artist. To Karenina, the splendidly painted black lace on the head, the black hair, and the beautiful white hand with many rings on the third finger suggested something intolerably bold and provocative. After looking at the portrait for about a minute, he shuddered, and his lips trembled and made a sound like brr as he turned away. He sat down hurriedly and opened his book. He tried to read, but could not awaken in himself the lively interest he had felt for the Ujibine tables. His eyes were on the book, but he was thinking about something else. He was not thinking of his wife, but of a complication that had recently arisen in his official activity, and at present constituted the chief interest of his work. He felt that he now saw more deeply than ever into that complication, and that a capital idea, he might say that without flattering himself, had occurred to him, which would disentangle the whole business, raise him in his official career, upset his enemies, and therefore be of the greatest value to the state. As soon as the footman, who had brought in the tea, had left the room, Karenina rose and went to the writing table. Drawing toward himself the portfolio of current affairs, with a scarcely perceptible smile of self-satisfaction, he took a pencil from the stand and became absorbed in reading some intricate papers he had sent for, relating to the impending complication. The complication was this: Karenina's official peculiarity, his characteristic trait. Every successful official has a special trait, which together with his determined ambition, self-restraint, honesty and self-confidence, had made him successful, consisted in a contempt for red tape, a curtailment of correspondence, economy, and, as far as possible, a direct relation with the real facts. It so happened that the important committee of June 2nd had brought before it the question of irrigation in the Zaraisk province, which belonged to Karenina's department, and presented a striking example of unproductive expenditure and useless red tape methods. Karenina knew that this was really so. The field irrigation of the Zaraisk province had been started by the predecessor of Karenina's predecessor. A great deal of money had been and was being spent quite unproductively on that business, and it was evident that the scheme would lead to nothing. When Karenina had first taken up his present post, he had at once realized this, and had wished to stop it. But, till he felt himself firmly seated, he knew that it would not be wise to do so, as too many interests were involved. Afterwards, being occupied with other matters, he had simply forgotten the business. Like all such matters, it went on of itself, by inertia. Many people lived by it, especially one very moral and musical family in which the daughters all played stringed instruments. Karenina was acquainted with that family and gave away one of the daughters at her marriage. The raising of this question by a hostile department was, in Karenina's opinion, dishonest, because in every ministry there were still graver matters which, out of recognized official decency, no one ever questions. But since the gauntlet had been thrown down, he would take it up boldly and would demand the appointment of a special committee to investigate and report upon the work of the Committee of Irrigation in the Zareichs province. But at the same time, he would not yield an inch to those gentlemen who had raised the question. He would demand the appointment of a special committee to inquire into the case of the subject races in that province. The case of the subject races had been accidentally raised at the committee of 2nd June, and had been energetically insisted on by Karenina as a matter of urgency in view of their wretched condition. At the committee, this question had caused conflict between several ministries. The ministry opposed to Karenina had argued that the condition of the subject races was most flourishing, and that the projected rearrangement might destroy their prosperity, while, if there was really anything unsatisfactory, it all resulted from the neglect by Karenina's department of the measures prescribed by the law. Now Karenina meant to demand, first, that a new commission should be formed to investigate locally the conditions of the subject races. Secondly, should those conditions prove to be such as they appear to be from the official reports already received, that another scientific commission should be appointed to study the causes of this deplorable condition of the subject races in the following aspects: A. Political, B. Administrative, C. Economic, D. Ethnographic, E. Material, and F. Religious. Thirdly, that information should be demanded from the hostile department concerning the measures it had taken during the last 10 years to avert the unfavourable conditions to which the subject races were now exposed. And fourthly, that the department in question should be required to explain why it had acted in direct contradiction to the meaning of the fundamental and organic law, as appeared from the statements submitted to the committee and numbered 17015 and 18308 of 5th December 1863 and 7th June 1864. A flush of animation suffused Karenina's face as he rapidly wrote out a summary of these ideas. Having covered a sheet of foolscap, he wrote, rang, and sent off a note to his chief secretary, asking for some necessary references that had to be looked up. After walking up and down the room, he again looked at the portrait, frowned, and smiled contemptuously. He once more took up the book on the Ujibine tables, and, having reawakened an interest in them, at 11 o'clock went to bed, and when as he lay there he remembered what had occurred with his wife, it no longer appeared to him in such gloomy colours.